Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn military jacket as she walked through the gates of the NATO base in Kabul. The dust kicked up by her boots seemed to mirror the storm of uncertainty in her chest. At 28, she had seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age, but today felt different. Today, she was starting over. The other soldiers at the base barely glanced her way as she made her way to the administrative building. Those who did look seemed to smirk or whisper among themselves. Sarah had grown used to this reaction over the years. Being a woman in special operations wasn't easy, especially when you look like someone who should be teaching kindergarten rather than neutralizing enemy targets. "You must be Mitchell," said a gruff voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a stocky sergeant with graying hair and suspicious eyes. "I'm Sergeant Williams." "You're late." "Traffic was heavy," Sarah replied simply, though they both knew there wasn't much traffic on a military base at 6 in the morning. Williams looked her up and down with obvious disappointment. "So you're the hotshot they sent us from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Gotta say, you don't look like much." Sarah had heard variations of this comment hundreds of times before. She kept her expression neutral as she followed Williams through the corridors lined with motivational posters and mission briefings. "Listen, Mitchell," Williams continued as they walked, "I don't know what strings you pulled to get assigned here, but this isn't some peacekeeping mission. We're dealing with real threats out there. Lives depend on every decision we make." They stopped outside a door marked Briefing Room C. Through the glass, Sarah could see a dozen soldiers sitting around a table, all men, all looking like they could bench press a small car. "The team's been together for 3 years," Williams explained. "They trust each other with their lives. You're an unknown variable, and unknown variables get people killed." Sarah nodded. She understood the concern, even if she didn't appreciate the assumption that she was somehow less capable because of her gender or appearance. Williams opened the door and announced, "Gentlemen, meet your new team member, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell." The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes studied her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright skepticism. Sarah had been through this before, but it never got easier. "This is a joke, right?" asked a tall soldier with a thick Boston accent. "They sent us a secretary?" A few of the men chuckled. Sarah remained standing at attention, her face revealing nothing. "Mitchell comes highly recommended," Williams said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. "She's got experience in urban warfare and reconnaissance." "Experience doing what exactly?" asked another soldier, this one with sergeant stripes and a crooked nose that had clearly been broken more than once. "Making coffee for the real soldiers?" More laughter filled the room. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but she kept it buried. She had learned long ago that reactions only made things worse. "All right, that's enough," Williams said, though he seemed more amused than concerned. "Mitchell, take a seat. We've got a mission briefing in 5 minutes." Sarah found an empty chair at the far end of the table. The soldier next to her, a young man who couldn't have been older than 22, scooted his chair away slightly, as if her presence might somehow contaminate him. As Williams began setting up the projector, the whispered comments continued around the table. "I heard they're forcing diversity quotas now," someone muttered. "Great, now we have to babysit. Wonder if she even knows which end of a rifle to hold." Sarah stared straight ahead, focusing on her breathing. She had endured worse treatment during her early days in the Rangers. Back then, she had tried to prove herself with words, with arguments about her qualifications and achievements. It never worked. The only thing that ever changed minds was performance in the field. The mission briefing began with intelligence about a suspected weapons cache in a compound about 20 kilometers north of the base. It was routine reconnaissance, the kind of operation Sarah had completed dozens of times before. But, as Williams outlined the plan, she noticed several tactical flaws that could potentially compromise the mission. When Williams finished, he asked for questions. Sarah raised her hand. "Sir, the approach route you've outlined takes us through a valley that's been used for ambushes before. Satellite imagery from last week shows tire tracks suggesting recent enemy activity in that area." Williams frowned. "And you know this how?" "I studied the intelligence reports before coming here. The alternative route through the eastern ridge would provide better cover and multiple escape routes if things go wrong. The room was quiet now, but the silence felt different than before. A few of the soldiers were actually listening. Sergeant Kowalski, the man with the crooked nose, leaned back in his chair. "You memorized satellite imagery?" "It's my job to know the terrain," Sarah replied. "Your job is to do what you're told," Williams shot back. "We've been running operations here for years. I think we know the area better than someone who just arrived." Sarah nodded and said nothing more. She had made her point. Whether they listened or not was up to them. After the briefing, as the soldiers filed out of the room, Sarah heard more comments. "Know it all. Thinks she's smarter than everyone else. Probably read about combat in a book." Only one soldier approached her as she gathered her notes. He was older than the others, maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes and graying temples. "I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, you were right about the valley route. We lost 2 vehicles to IEDs there last month." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Then, why didn't Williams listen?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Pride, mostly. Williams is a good soldier, but he doesn't like being questioned, especially by someone he sees as an outsider." "What about you? Do you see me as an outsider?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "I see someone who did her homework. That's more than I can say for some of the guys we've had assigned here." It was a small kindness, but Sarah appreciated it more than she could express. In a world where respect had to be earned inch by inch, Rodriguez's words felt like a victory. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, picking at her dinner while around her, groups of soldiers laughed and shared stories from their day. She had always been something of a loner, but the isolation felt more acute here, surrounded by people who saw her as a burden rather than an asset. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister back home. "How's the new assignment? Making friends already?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, still settling in. She didn't mention the comments, the skeptical looks, or the way Williams had dismissed her tactical assessment. Her sister worried enough already. When Sarah had first enlisted, her family had been supportive but terrified. They didn't understand why she felt called to serve, especially in such a dangerous capacity. The truth was, Sarah had always felt most alive when facing challenges that others deemed impossible. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children, she had learned early that she had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. That drive had carried her through Ranger training, through multiple deployments, and through countless moments like today when giving up would have been easier. As she finished her meal, Sarah noticed a commotion near the entrance to the mess hall. Several soldiers were clustered around a bulletin board, their voices animated with excitement. "Did you see who's coming to inspect the base next week?" one of them was saying. "Commander Reynolds himself. The Ghost. I heard he once took out an entire enemy squad with nothing but a knife and his bare hands." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Commander Reynolds. She knew that name, though she had never met the man. Every special operations soldier knew stories about Marcus Reynolds, the SEAL commander whose legendary missions had become the stuff of military folklore. As she listened to the soldiers discussing Reynolds' upcoming visit, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. High-ranking inspections usually meant increased scrutiny for everyone, but especially for new team members who hadn't yet proven themselves. Williams appeared in the doorway and called for attention. "All right, listen up. We've got confirmation that Commander Reynolds will be here for a full operational review next Friday. I want this base running like clockwork. Any soldier who embarrasses this unit will be scrubbing latrines until their next deployment." His eyes found Sarah across the room. That goes double for anyone who thinks they know better than their commanding officers. The message was clear. Sarah was being put on notice. After dinner, she returned to her quarters, a small room she shared with another female soldier who was currently on leave. The space felt cramped and impersonal, but it was hers for now. Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed her standing with her ranger squad after a successful mission in Syria 2 years earlier. They all looked tired but triumphant, arms draped over each other's shoulders in the way that only soldiers who had faced death together could manage. She missed that feeling of belonging, of being part of something bigger than herself. Here at the NATO base, she felt like she was fighting just to be acknowledged as a legitimate member of the team. But Sarah had not come this far to give up now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself. She would continue to do her job with professionalism and competence, regardless of what others thought or said. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror mounted on the wall. The reflection showed a tired young woman with determined eyes. But, hidden beneath her standard-issue t-shirt, invisible to everyone around her, was a tattoo that told a different story entirely. The tattoo covered most of her upper back, a detailed image of a hawk in flight, its wings spread wide and talons extended. But this wasn't just any hawk. The detail work was extraordinary, showing the bird as if it were made of shadows and mist, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Sarah had gotten the tattoo 2 years earlier, after a mission that had changed everything about how she saw herself and her capabilities. It wasn't the kind of story she shared with anyone, not even her family. Some experiences were too personal, too significant to be reduced to words. The ghost hawk, as she thought of it, represented something that few people would understand. It wasn't about aggression or violence, though she was capable of both when necessary. It was about precision, patience, and the ability to strike from the shadows when conventional approaches failed. As Sarah turned off the light and settled into her narrow bunk, she thought about the week ahead. Commander Reynolds' visit would undoubtedly bring challenges, but it might also bring opportunities. She had heard that Reynolds was different from other high-ranking officers, that he judged soldiers based on ability rather than appearance or preconceptions. Perhaps it was time for the ghost hawk to make herself known. The next morning brought another round of skeptical glances and whispered comments as Sarah joined her squad for physical training. They were scheduled for a 5-mile run followed by combat drills, the kind of routine that Sarah could complete in her sleep. As they lined up at the starting point, Sergeant Kowalski made a show of stretching dramatically. "Hope you can keep up, Mitchell. We don't slow down for anyone." Sarah said nothing, just adjusted her shoelaces and waited for the signal to begin. When the whistle blew, the squad took off at a punishing pace. It was clearly a test, an attempt to see if Sarah would fall behind and prove their assumptions correct. But, as they ran through the dusty streets of the base, past equipment yards and administrative buildings, Sarah found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm. The pace that seemed designed to break her felt almost relaxed compared to some of the training she had endured with the Rangers. By the 3rd mile, she was running near the front of the pack. By the 4th mile, only Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers were ahead of her. Kowalski, who had started strong, was beginning to lag. As they approached the finish line, Sarah made a decision. Instead of pushing ahead to prove a point, she slowed her pace slightly and finished in the middle of the group. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being part of the team. After the run, as soldiers bent over catching their breath, Rodriguez jogged over to where Sarah was stretching. "Nice pace out there," he said quietly. "But I noticed you held back at the end." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "I don't know what you mean." Rodriguez smiled. "I've been running these routes for 3 years. I know when someone's got more in the tank. Question is, why didn't you use it?" Before Sarah could answer, Williams called the squad to attention for combat drills. But, as they moved toward the training area, she caught Rodriguez watching her with a new expression, not suspicion, but curiosity. The combat drills consisted of live-fire exercises using mock urban environments. Each soldier would navigate through a maze of buildings, engaging targets while avoiding civilian cutouts. It was designed to test quick decision-making under pressure. Sarah watched as each member of her squad went through the course. They were competent, but she noticed patterns in their movements, predictable approaches that a real enemy would quickly learn to exploit. When her turn came, Williams made another show of explaining the rules, as if she had never participated in live-fire training before. "Remember, Mitchell, this isn't a video game. Real bullets, real consequences if you make a mistake. Sarah nodded and checked her weapon. The familiar weight of the rifle felt comforting in her hands. When the signal came, she moved into the maze with fluid confidence. Unlike the other soldiers who had charged through aggressively, Sarah moved with calculated precision. She used shadows and cover points that others had missed, approaching each target from unexpected angles. Her shooting was flawless. Every hostile target was neutralized with single, precise shots. Every civilian cutout remained untouched. But, more impressive than her accuracy was her movement through the course. Where others had followed predictable paths, Sarah seemed to flow like water, appearing and disappearing behind cover in ways that would have made her nearly impossible to track in a real combat situation. When she emerged from the course, the timer showed that she had not only been faster than anyone else, but had used half as much ammunition to achieve better results. The squad stood in stunned silence. Williams cleared his throat. "Lucky run," he said finally. "Let's see if you can do it again." Sarah ran the course 2 more times. Her results were consistent, fast, precise, and deadly efficient. As the squad packed up their equipment, Sarah heard a different kind of whisper circulating among the soldiers. "Did you see how she moved? Like a ghost. Where the hell did she learn to shoot like that?" For the first time since arriving at the base, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She was beginning to make an impression, though she suspected the real test was yet to come. Commander Reynolds was due to arrive in 4 days. Sarah had a feeling that his visit would change everything, though she couldn't yet imagine how dramatically her world was about to shift. That evening, as she cleaned her rifle in the armory, Rodriguez approached her workstation. "Mind if I ask you something personal?" Sarah looked up from her weapon. "Depends on how personal." "That shooting today. That wasn't normal training. That was something else entirely." Rodriguez paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've worked with a lot of special operations soldiers over the years. What I saw today, that looked like someone with very specialized experience." Sarah considered her response. Rodriguez had been kind to her, but she wasn't ready to share her full story with anyone. "I've had good training," she said simply. Rodriguez nodded, but his expression suggested he suspected there was more to it. "Well, whoever trained you did a hell of a job." As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah returned to cleaning her rifle. But her mind was already moving ahead to the challenges that awaited her. Commander Reynolds' visit would bring scrutiny, but it might also bring the opportunity she had been waiting for. The Ghost Hawk was patient. But she was also ready to fly. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation for Commander Reynolds' arrival. Every surface on the base was scrubbed until it gleamed, every piece of equipment inspected and re-inspected. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah found herself caught between wanting to prove herself and trying not to draw unwanted attention. On Wednesday morning, 2 days before Reynolds was scheduled to arrive, everything changed. Sarah was in the communications tent, reviewing intelligence reports, when the emergency alarm began blaring across the base. Within seconds, soldiers were running in all directions as Williams' voice crackled over the loudspeakers. Code Red. All combat personnel report to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. Sarah grabbed her gear and ran toward the briefing room, her heart pounding. Code Red meant active enemy contact or imminent threat. As she burst through the doors, she saw the rest of her squad already assembled, their faces grim. Williams stood at the front of the room next to a large monitor displaying satellite imagery. "Gentlemen, and Mitchell, we have a situation. 30 minutes ago, a convoy carrying medical supplies to the village of Kamal was ambushed 15 kilometers from here." The room erupted in angry murmurs. Supply convoys to local villages were considered humanitarian missions, generally respected even by hostile forces. Williams raised his hand for silence. 3 vehicles, 12 personnel. We lost contact with them 22 minutes ago. Last transmission indicated they were taking heavy fire and had casualties. Sarah studied the map on the screen. The ambush site was in a narrow valley surrounded by rocky hills, perfect terrain for insurgents to attack and, then, disappear into the mountains. Our orders are simple, Williams continued. Locate the convoy, neutralize any threats, and evacuate casualties. We roll out in 15 minutes. As the soldiers began checking their weapons and equipment, Sarah approached Williams. Sir, I've studied this area. The terrain is extremely challenging for vehicle approach. Have you considered? Williams cut her off. Mitchell, this is real combat, not a training exercise. Stay close to Rodriguez and try not to get yourself or anyone else killed. Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration, but she kept her expression neutral. There was no time to argue tactics now. 15 minutes later, 4 Humvees raced through the gates of the NATO base, kicking up clouds of dust as they headed toward the ambush site. Sarah rode in the second vehicle with Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers, her rifle ready and her mind focused on the mission ahead. The ride to the valley took 25 minutes through increasingly rough terrain. As they approached the coordinates where the convoy had last reported, Williams' voice crackled through their radio headsets. All vehicles stop here. We go on foot from this point. The squad dismounted and began advancing through the rocky terrain toward the valley where the ambush had occurred. Sarah could smell smoke in the air before they crested the ridge and saw the devastation below. 3 burning vehicles sat in the middle of the narrow road. Bodies were scattered around them, some moving, some ominously still. And, positioned in the hills on both sides of the valley, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions. Jesus Christ, whispered one of the soldiers. Williams was already coordinating with base command through his radio. Command, this is Team 7. We have visual on the convoy. Multiple casualties, hostile forces still active in the area. The response came immediately. Team 7, you are cleared to engage. Medevac is en route but won't arrive for 30 minutes. Do whatever it takes to secure those survivors. Williams studied the valley through his binoculars. All right, here's the plan. Kowalski and Thomas, you take the left flank. Rodriguez and Martinez, take the right. Mitchell and I will provide covering fire from here while you move to secure the survivors. Sarah looked at the tactical situation with growing alarm. Williams' plan would send half their force into the open valley where they would be exposed to crossfire from the hills on both sides. It was exactly the kind of frontal assault that got soldiers killed. Sir, she said quietly, this plan puts our people in a kill zone. The enemy has high ground advantage and clear lines of sight. We need to neutralize the hill positions first. Williams turned to her with irritation. I don't have time for your textbook theories, Mitchell. People are dying down there. Sarah watched as Kowalski and Thomas began moving down into the valley. Almost immediately, enemy fire intensified, kicking up dust around their feet as they ran for cover behind the burning vehicles. Taking heavy fire. Kowalski's voice came through the radio. Can't advance further. Rodriguez and Martinez were pinned down on the opposite side, unable to reach the survivors without crossing open ground under direct enemy fire. Sarah made a quick decision. Without asking permission, she began moving away from Williams' position, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement as she circled toward the eastern hill where she had spotted the heaviest enemy fire. Mitchell! Williams hissed into his radio. Where the hell are you going? Trust me, Sarah replied, already 30 meters away and moving fast through the rocks. What happened next would be talked about on the base for months afterward. Sarah moved through the terrain like she had been born to it. Where other soldiers would have struggled with the loose rocks and steep inclines, she seemed to flow around obstacles, using natural cover and shadows to mask her advance. The insurgents positioned on the eastern hill never saw her coming. Her first target was a sniper positioned behind a large boulder about 60 meters from her squad's position. Sarah approached from his blind side, moving with absolute silence across the rocky ground. When she was close enough, she eliminated him with a single precise shot. The second position held 3 insurgents with an automatic weapon. They were focused on the valley below, laying down suppressive fire to keep the rescue team pinned. Sarah positioned herself above them on a rocky outcrop and eliminated all three with quick, accurate shots before they realized they were under attack. By the time she reached the third position, word had spread among the insurgents that they were being hunted. But their attempts to locate and engage her were futile. Sarah moved like a ghost through the rocks, appearing long enough to neutralize threats before vanishing back into the terrain. Within 15 minutes, she had eliminated 7 enemy combatants and destroyed their ability to maintain effective fire on the valley below. All positions neutralized on the eastern ridge, she reported calmly into her radio. The silence that followed her transmission was telling. Down in the valley, Kowalski and Thomas were staring up at the hills in amazement. With the eastern positions eliminated, Rodriguez and Martinez were able to advance and begin evacuating the wounded convoy personnel. Williams, meanwhile, was desperately trying to understand how one soldier had accomplished what should have required an entire squad. "Mitchell, report to my position," Williams ordered. When Sarah arrived back at Williams' overwatch position, she found him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How the hell did you do that?" he asked. Before Sarah could answer, Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. "Command, this is Team 7. We have secured the survivors. 4 wounded, 2 critical. We need that medevac now." The medical helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, landing in a cloud of dust and rotor wash. As the wounded were loaded aboard, Sarah helped carry one of the injured soldiers, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, his leg badly damaged by shrapnel. "Thank you," he whispered as they placed him on the stretcher. "I thought we were all going to die out there." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're safe now." As the helicopter lifted off toward the base hospital, Williams approached Sarah. His expression was different now, not exactly friendly, but no longer dismissive. "That was some impressive shooting up there," he said. "Just doing my job, sir." Williams studied her for a long moment. "Your job was to provide covering fire. What you did up there, that was something else entirely." The ride back to base was quiet. Sarah could feel the other soldiers looking at her differently now, but she wasn't sure if it was with respect or suspicion. She had revealed more of her capabilities than she had intended, and she wasn't certain that was wise. That evening, as Sarah cleaned her rifle in the armory, she was surprised to find several members of her squad approaching her workstation. "Mitchell," Kowalski said, his voice awkward but sincere, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Sarah looked up from her weapon. "For what?" "For treating you like you didn't belong here. What you did today, you saved those men's lives." Thomas, the young soldier who had been so skeptical of her abilities, stepped forward. "How did you learn to move like that? I've never seen anything like it." Sarah considered her response carefully. "Good training," she said simply. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Mitchell, Williams wants to see you in his office." Sarah set down her cleaning supplies and followed Rodriguez through the corridors to Williams' office. She expected to face questions about her unauthorized movement during the mission, possibly even disciplinary action. Instead, she found Williams sitting behind his desk with a file folder open in front of him. When she entered, he gestured to a chair. "Have a seat, Mitchell. We need to talk." Sarah sat down, keeping her expression neutral. Williams leaned back in his chair. "I've been doing some research since we got back from the mission. Your file makes for interesting reading." Sarah said nothing, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. 75 successful missions with the Rangers. 3 Purple Hearts. A silver star that you received for actions classified so heavily that even I can't access the details. Williams paused. "What exactly did you do to earn that silver star?" "I can't discuss classified operations, sir." Williams nodded slowly. "Of course you can't. But what I saw today gives me some ideas." He closed the file and leaned forward. "Commander Reynolds arrives tomorrow. I'm going to recommend that he meet with you personally." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "May I ask why, sir?" "Because I think there's more to your story than you're telling anyone." and I think Commander Reynolds might be interested in hearing it." That night, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Tomorrow would bring Commander Reynolds, and, with him, questions that she might not be able to avoid answering. The mission that had earned her the Silver Star was something she rarely allowed herself to think about. It had happened 18 months ago in Syria, during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Her squad had been surrounded by enemy forces in an abandoned industrial complex. Communications were down, air support was unavailable, and they were outnumbered 5-1. The situation was hopeless. That was when Sarah had done something that surprised even herself. Moving alone through the complex at night, she had systematically eliminated 23 enemy combatants over the course of 4 hours, using techniques that weren't taught in any military manual she knew of. She moved through the darkness like a predator, striking from shadows and vanishing before the enemy could respond. By dawn, she had created enough chaos and confusion to allow her squad to break out and reach the extraction point. The after-action report had been classified at the highest levels, and Sarah had been quietly transferred to a new unit where her unusual skills could be developed further. It was after that mission that she had gotten the Ghost Hawk tattoo. Not as a celebration, but as a reminder of what she was capable of when pushed to her limits. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for Commander Reynolds' visit. She dressed carefully in her cleanest uniform, checked and double-checked her appearance in the mirror. At precisely 1000 hours, a convoy of black SUVs rolled through the base gates. Sarah watched from her position in the formation of soldiers assembled to greet the visiting commander. When Commander Marcus Reynolds stepped out of the lead vehicle, Sarah understood immediately why he was called the Ghost. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable with danger, his eyes constantly scanning the environment around him. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 40, with prematurely gray hair and scars on his hands that spoke of extensive combat experience. Reynolds walked down the line of assembled soldiers, stopping to speak with several of them. When he reached Sarah, he paused for a moment longer than with the others. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas accent. "I've been hearing interesting things about you." "Sir?" Sarah replied, maintaining perfect military bearing. Reynolds smiled slightly. "We'll talk later." The formal inspection lasted 2 hours. Reynolds toured the facilities, observed training exercises, and met with the base command staff. Throughout it all, Sarah remained with her squad, but she could feel the commander's eyes on her at various moments. Finally, as the afternoon wound down, Williams approached Sarah. "Commander Reynolds would like to speak with you privately. Conference room B, 15 minutes. Sarah's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." 15 minutes later, she stood outside conference room B, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. "Enter," came Reynolds' voice from inside. Sarah opened the door to find Commander Reynolds sitting alone at the conference table, a cup of coffee and an open file folder in front of him. "Have a seat, Sergeant Mitchell," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sarah sat down, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Reynolds studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been reading about your mission yesterday. Impressive work." "Thank you, sir. Sergeant Williams tells me you eliminated 7 enemy combatants while moving alone through hostile terrain. He also tells me that you did it in a way that he's never seen before." Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "I'm curious about that." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I used the terrain to my advantage and engaged targets from unexpected positions." Reynolds smiled. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you moved through those rocks like a ghost and killed 7 armed insurgents without them ever knowing you were there." Sarah said nothing. Reynolds opened the file folder and pulled out several documents. "Your record is interesting reading. Multiple commendations for marksmanship, advanced training in urban warfare, reconnaissance specialist certification." He paused. "And then, there's Syria." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Sir?" "The mission that earned you a Silver Star." The one that's classified so heavily that I had to use my security clearance just to read the summary. Reynolds set the documents aside. 23 enemy combatants eliminated in a single night. Your entire squad extracted safely. 0 friendly casualties. Sarah remains silent. The report describes your actions as unprecedented tactical innovation under extreme circumstances, Reynolds continued. But, between you and me, that sounds like military speak for something that shouldn't have been possible. Reynolds stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base beyond. Tell me something, Sergeant Mitchell. Have you ever heard of a program called Project Night Strike? Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She had heard rumors about Night Strike, whispers of an ultra-classified program that selected certain soldiers for specialized training in unconventional warfare techniques. I'm not familiar with that program, sir. Reynolds turned back to her. Of course you're not. Officially, it doesn't exist. He returned to his seat and leaned forward. But, unofficially, it's a program that identifies soldiers with unusual aptitudes for what we call asymmetric warfare. Soldiers who can operate effectively in situations where conventional tactics fail. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I don't understand where this is going, sir. Reynolds smiled. I think you understand perfectly. The question is whether you're ready to acknowledge what you are. Before Sarah could respond, Reynolds reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the table between them. The photograph showed Sarah during the Syria mission, taken by satellite imagery. She was moving across the roof of a building at night, her figure barely visible against the darkness. But what made Sarah's breath catch was the way she looked in the image, like a shadow given form, like something that wasn't quite human. This photo was taken during your mission in Syria, Reynolds said quietly. It's the only clear image we have of you in action that night. Do you know what this reminds me of? Sarah stared at the photograph, seeing herself as others must have seen her that night, something deadly and ethereal moving through the darkness. A ghost, she whispered. Reynolds nodded. Not just any ghost. A very specific kind of ghost. The kind that hunts in the night sky. Sarah's hand unconsciously moved toward her back, where the ghost hawk tattoo lay hidden beneath her uniform. Somehow, she suspected that Commander Reynolds knew about that too. Sir, Reynolds held up a hand. You don't need to say anything right now. But, I want you to think about something. He stood up and moved toward the door. Tomorrow, I'm flying back to my base in Virginia. If you decide you're ready to learn what you really are, there's a place for you on that flight. He paused with his hand on the door handle. Oh, and, Sergeant Mitchell? You might want to consider what happens when someone finally sees the hawk that's been hiding in plain sight. After Reynolds left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at the photograph of herself in Syria. For the first time since arriving at the NATO base, she felt truly seen, not as a curiosity or a burden, but as something far more complex and dangerous. The ghost hawk was no longer just a tattoo on her back. It was becoming a reality that she might no longer be able to hide. Sarah spent the entire night walking the perimeter of the base.